Hey there, friends. Welcome. I'm so glad you decided to join me tonight for a journey through time, a gentle exploration of one of history's most beautiful stories. Before we settle in together, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Dim those lights, maybe turn on a soft fan or some gentle white noise in the background, something soothing to accompany our time together. If you genuinely enjoy these kinds of stories, please do like the video and subscribe, but only if this truly resonates with you. I'd love to know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. There's something truly magical about knowing we have people listening from all across the world, all at different times, all seeking the same quiet comfort this story provides. Now then, let's ease into tonight's journey together. Find that comfortable position, maybe pull a blanket a little closer, and let's begin with a creature who has shaped human history far more profoundly than half the kings we've ever had. A creature so woven into our story that we often forget there was ever a time before them. Tonight, we begin with the dog, the frozen world, survival in the Ice Age. Picture this with me, if you will. Wrap yourself mentally in animal skins that smell like ancient regret and the dampness of time. You're sitting beside a fire, and I use the word fire generously, something that barely deserves the title, something that flickers with the kind of warmth that makes you question whether it's worth the smoke. Your entire clan looks like a collection of exhausted creatures wearing clothing made from things they'd rather not think about too carefully. The night air around you carry the kind of cold that doesn't just bite, it whispers warnings about mortality. Dinner is served, a chunk of mammoth meat so thoroughly burnt it has essentially become charcoal. Someone optimistically calls it well done. The spirits around your camp are remarkably low. Hygiene is a concept that hasn't been invented yet, and probably won't be for quite some time. Hope itself feels like a distant myth, something told in stories around other fires in other lands. The Ice Age was not the magical snowy landscape that modern imagination sometimes conjures. It was not a place of wonder and discovery. It was, quite simply, a frozen nightmare carefully designed by nature at its most sadistic. Temperatures tried to kill you, predators tried to kill you, even your own campfire sometimes tried to kill you by collapsing dangerously close to where you slept. Humanity survived out of pure stubbornness, questionable decision-making, and the occasional stroke of accidental luck. Then you hear it, a sound from the darkness beyond your firelight, a low growl, nothing subtle about it, nothing remotely friendly in its tone. The kind of growl that says, with absolute clarity, I am seriously considering eating you, and I'm not particularly worried about consequences. It's wolves. Of course it's wolves, because the Ice Age didn't run short on things trying to kill you. These wolves have been watching your camp all day long, judging your hunting skills with what can only be described as disappointment. To them, you're nothing more than a walking disappointment with a pulse, a collection of flesh that happened to learn how to make fire. But tonight, something unusual happens, something that will echo through every century to come. From the shadows steps the world's least successful wolf. Imagine a wolf who lost every competition, who got pushed around by squirrels, who was born into a pack and immediately regretted it. This wolf is scrawny, awkward in ways wolves shouldn't be, clearly the bottom of the pack, the one nobody wanted to hunt with, the one everyone was happy to see leave. He's starving, he's desperate, and he's making the worst possible decision of his life, approaching humans who have spears and deeply rooted anxiety about strange animals. He pads closer to the firelight, moving slowly, almost uncertainly. The humans panic internally. Spears are gripped a little tighter. Everyone freezes because nobody wants to be the first one eaten. Not tonight, not when there's already so much suffering to manage. The wolf looks at a mammoth bone, one stripped mostly clean but still holding fragments of something edible. He looks at it with the exact expression your pet dog uses when you open a bag of chips. That expression of complete, undivided desire, pure want distilled into a stare. And then, in an act of ancient, world-changing stupidity, someone throws him a scrap. The first agreement. Not out of kindness. Kindness is a luxury the Ice Age doesn't permit. Not out of hope. Hope is equally scarce. Just maybe, just possibly, if this creature eats this offering, he won't eat us. That's the entire negotiation. That's the entire first contract between two species. Pure practical desperation. The wolf grabs the scrap and trots back into the darkness. His tail twitches, whether from gratitude or indigestion history doesn't say. But he returns the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that, falling into a pattern neither species planned, but both seem to understand. Soon he's sitting closer to the warmth. He's sleeping nearby, and most surprisingly, he's growling at other predators in a way that sounds almost protective. He's begun to act like he works security for the camp. Humans tolerate him because, let's be honest, life is significantly easier when something with sharp teeth is on your side, rather than against it. It's a straightforward calculation. Keep the wolf fed, and the wolf keeps other predators at bay. It's not love yet. It's not friendship. It's a transaction, pure and simple. But transactions, given enough time and enough shared nights around a fire, can become something deeper. Little by little, almost without anyone noticing it happening, the relationship transforms. The killer becomes the freeloader. The freeloader becomes a companion. The creature that once hunted humans becomes, through the simple passage of days and weeks and months, the very first dog. All because two species were too cold, too hungry, and too tired to kill each other. All because survival didn't leave room for the luxury of fear. Once this first unlikely wolf realized that humans were basically a walking buffet of half-cooked disappointment, he brought friends, not his impressive relatives, the cool, confident alpha wolves with muscles and pride. No, those wolves had standards they weren't willing to compromise. These were the outcasts, the weirdos, the wolves whose own mothers probably sighed when they looked at them, the kind of wolves who looked at their reflection in a frozen pond and thought, well, I'm trying my best, I suppose. These wolves discovered humanity's greatest invention, and I say this knowing about fire and agriculture and the wheel. These wolves discovered the garbage pile. To Ice Age wolves, the human trash heap was like stumbling into a Michelin star restaurant where the chef is blindfolded and hates his job intensely. Burnt bones, meat scraps, fat trimmings, all the things humans threw away because even when starving, they said absolutely not to them. Wolves loved every discarded scrap. To them, it was gourmet cuisine. To them, it was salvation. Soon enough, these rejected wolves began hanging around the very edges of human camps, close enough to smell the stew that simmered with sadness, close enough to see the warmth of the fire, but far enough away to run if someone threw a rock or shouted aggressively. It was a relationship built entirely on fear, caution, and an extremely low bar for what qualified as good cuisine. Humans, for their part, made a remarkable discovery. The wolves that stayed, the ones that kept returning, were consistently the ones that didn't immediately try to remove someone's leg. This was, believe it or not, a valuable trait in the Ice Age, an evolutionary advantage worth noting. So the dynamic began to shift and change. Wolves approached camp. Humans gripped their spears tighter, ready for danger. Wolves made their very best I'm harmless and pathetic face, that expression of surrender mixed with hunger. Humans, exhausted by the constant threat of death, sighed and tossed a bone. Someone muttered something about how this definitely wasn't their job, but they tossed it anyway. Night after night, the pattern repeated. The wolves who were the least aggressive, the most starving, the most willing to submit, those were the ones that returned. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, these wolves began to change, not spiritually, not philosophically. Evolution simply looked at the situation and said, Let's make these creatures smaller, less threatening, dumber, and somehow more appealing to humans who clearly can't resist a fixer-upper project. Snouts shortened, eyes widened, tails began wagging, possibly accidentally at first, when one particularly enthusiastic wolf got excited about leftovers and discovered that the tail movement earned even more leftovers. Gradually, almost without anyone realizing it was happening, the wolves became less "I might eat your children" and more "I'm here for snacks and emotional support and maybe a warm place to sleep." But the wolves weren't engaging in charity. They received something valuable in return for their transformation. Warmth from human fires, protection from larger predators, a stable food supply, assuming humans actually caught anything edible that day. The occasional piece of mammoth jerky because desperation makes cooks generous. Evolution had created something extraordinary. It had transformed a deadly predator into the world's first professional trash eater. And humans, perhaps for the first time in their brutal existence, felt slightly safer. Not because they were stronger, not because they were smarter, but because a wolf with absolutely no ambition had decided that living with humans was easier than competing with other wolves. Welcome to the birth of domestication, the laziest yet most successful partnership in all of history. Domestication wasn't a magical moment where a wolf suddenly rolled over and declared, "I think I'll be adorable now." It wasn't a conscious choice made by either species. No, it was thousands of years of slow, reluctant evolution, driven primarily by hunger, laziness, and the gradual realization that biting humans was a poor career strategy. At this point in our story, the wolves hanging around human camps weren't exactly wolves anymore. They were wolf-shaped disappointments, the runts, the socially anxious ones, the individuals who couldn't hunt successfully, couldn't fight effectively, and probably failed basic wolf school spectacularly. If wolves had student loans, these were the ones defaulting on them while their families pretended not to know them. But these were also the wolves who discovered something revolutionary. Acting slightly less murderous gets you more free food. This was the dawn of survival through cuteness. A wolf with a slightly rounder face received more leftovers. A wolf who didn't growl at toddlers got invited closer to the fire. A wolf whose tail wiggles instead of thrashing in rage got sounds of approval. Those little awe noises that trigger some ancient human instinct to give away snacks you desperately need. And so, generation after generation, these camp wolves changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but slowly, like a bad haircut growing out over months, they transformed. Their skulls shrank. Their teeth softened and dulled. Their eyes widened into an expression that scientists now, with some amusement, classify as emotionally manipulative. Wolves became dogs the exact same way influencers are born, by performing harmless behavior until someone pays attention and decides to provide support. Meanwhile, humans began noticing something unexpected. These newly evolved proto-dogs didn't just stop attacking. They started helping, not perfectly, not reliably, but helping nonetheless. One wolf might bark when a predator approached, probably not on purpose, but the effect was useful. Another might trail behind hunters hoping for scraps and accidentally contribute to the hunt just by being there. A third might simply sit in camp, providing what we might generously call emotional support to someone who had just lost an argument with a berry bush. Humans looked at these creatures, smaller than wolves, friendlier than wolves, about 10 times less competent than wolves, and thought, this one might actually survive if we protect it. So they did. The strong wolves died out or moved on. The cute, needy, clingy ones thrived and multiplied. Evolution applauded this new strategy called being adorable. The great transformation continued, from predator to scavenger, from scavenger to sidekick, from sidekick to creature that sleeps in your bed and steals half your pillow. The murder instinct faded away like a bad memory. The feed-me instinct intensified with each passing generation, and humanity found itself raising the world's first professional loaf-shaped companion. By the time proto-dogs had fully committed to the less murder, more mooching lifestyle, humans began to realize something genuinely shocking. These small ex-wolves were actually useful. Not very competent, not very coordinated, but useful in the way a loud, anxious roommate is useful. They might not help with chores, but they will certainly yell when something sketchy happens outside. Dogs became the world's first alarm system. Picture a prehistoric night for me. The wind is howling through the darkness. The fire is crackling, providing both warmth and an illusion of safety. Your clan is trying to sleep through the sound of someone snoring like a dying mammoth. Suddenly, a rustle comes from the shadows. Before humans can even reach for their spears, one of the camp dogs erupts into frantic barking. Not brave, not heroic, just incredibly, persistently, impossibly loud. Loud enough to wake the dead. Loud enough to make predators seriously reconsider their life choices. This was revolutionary in ways we might not fully appreciate today. Humans had invented nothing that could do this. The security system they had before dogs consisted of listening very carefully for trouble and hoping your ears worked well enough to hear danger in time. Barking dogs changed that entire equation. They barked at predators, they barked at strangers, they barked at shadows, they barked at suspicious rocks, they barked at their own tails. Basically, they barked at anything they decided was terrifying at any given moment. And while prehistoric humans certainly had many problems, starvation, cold, predators, disease, and the general misery of existence, sleep deprivation from dog barking was probably their first shared universal experience. The first problem that crossed tribal boundaries and united all humans in frustrated exhaustion. But dogs weren't just noise machines. They were territorial. They adopted the camp as their personal domain. The same wolf who once considered humans as trail mix with limbs now patrolled around the fire like an overworked bouncer, taking the job far too seriously. Humans appreciated this immensely. They rewarded it with scraps, with affection, with pets, and with constant enabling. It's the exact same dynamic that still exists between dogs and humans today, thousands of years later. Soon, dogs discovered another superpower. They could track things far better than humans ever could. They could smell predators before humans even sensed danger approaching. They could distinguish between harmless noises and something that genuinely wanted to eat you. And though dogs rarely fought predators directly, bravery was still very much a work in progress for them. They excelled at loudly announcing danger and then bravely hiding behind humans. And humans, having grown accustomed to having something watching their backs, began viewing these messy, needy, tail-wagging creatures not as wild animals, but as something new, something like allies. Dogs weren't perfect. They still stole food. They still made questionable choices. They still panicked at absolutely nothing, which was frustrating and occasionally hilarious. But for the first time in prehistory, humans had something watching their backs, something loyal, something protective, something that occasionally did the right thing on purpose, even if it was accidental. The Ice Age was still brutal. Survival was still a daily struggle. But now, humans didn't face the darkness alone. Hunting partners, a new kind of strategy. By now, early dogs weren't just scavengers or furry alarm clocks keeping watch through the long nights. They were becoming something far more significant. They were becoming partners on what might be the most miserable team sport in human history, Ice Age hunting. A sport with rules so simple they're almost brutal. Catch something edible or starve. Preferably catch something that won't immediately turn around and catch your back, resulting in your own demise. Humans were decent hunters, I suppose. Sure, they had spears, crude implements but effective enough. They had teamwork and communication, however limited. They had the ability to complain loudly and continuously about everything. But dogs possessed superpowers that humans could only dream about. Noses capable of detecting prey from miles away, far beyond the range of human senses. Ears that twitched at the faintest snap of a twig, or the softest sound of movement in the underbrush, and energy levels that made humans seriously reconsider their own physical conditioning. A typical hunt went something like this. Humans spot a herd of something large, angry, and equipped with horns capable of rearranging your skeletal system in unfortunate ways. Dogs notice it too, usually before the humans do, and then they start barking like unpaid interns desperately trying to impress their boss. The noise startles the prey, which either runs away in panic or charges forward, depending entirely on the animal's mood and sense of humor. The dogs sprint ahead, fueled by excitement, adrenaline, and absolutely no thoughts whatsoever. Humans follow behind, fueled by hunger, fear, and the knowledge that their winter coat is literally falling apart at the seams. Together, they form the world's first dysfunctional hunting party. And somehow, surprisingly, it works. Dogs chase prey into traps carefully prepared by humans. Dogs flush animals from hiding spots where they've been trying to escape. Dogs track wounded creatures through forests that humans would get lost in instantly, never to be seen again. Dogs do all the dangerous legwork while humans show up at the end and throw spears like they contributed equally to the entire operation. And the best part? Dogs think this is genuinely fun. They have no concept of risk assessment. They don't understand fatal consequences. They're just thrilled to be involved in anything that isn't freezing to death or barking at a leaf that moved suspiciously. Of course, not every dog was a born hunter. Some dogs got distracted by butterflies when they should have been focusing on prey. Some chased the wrong animal for 2 hours straight before realizing their mistake. Some ran off entirely and returned later with a stick, proudly convinced they'd personally solved the hunger problem forever. But humans tolerated all of this because even the stupidest dog occasionally helped catch something genuinely edible. Ice Age hunting with dogs wasn't perfect. Far from it, actually. But it was better, faster, more successful than hunting alone, and most importantly, it bonded humans and dogs in shared triumph and shared trauma. There's nothing quite like nearly being trampled by a mammoth together to build trust between species. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, humans began to realize these creatures weren't just useful tools. They were becoming essential partners. Something dangerously close to friends, moving in the line that changed everything. Somewhere between barking at predators and chasing mammoths with questionable enthusiasm, dogs crossed an invisible line. They moved in, not in a formal way, with lease agreements and deposit payments. More in an, I'm cold, you're warm, and this arrangement benefits me significantly more than it benefits you kind of way. And humans, worn down by the Ice Age and centuries of poor decision-making, let it happen without much protest. Originally, dogs slept near the edges of campfires. Not too close. Humans smelled weird and made unpredictable noises in their sleep, which was unsettling, but close enough to enjoy the heat radiating from the flames. Then, one especially bold dog decided he was tired of frostbite and the constant cold that never seemed to leave. He simply walked into a human shelter like he owned the place. Humans stared. The dog stared back. Then he curled up in the corner and acted like this was completely normal and expected behavior. And just like that, humanity lost the living room. At first, only a few dogs did this. The bravest ones, the dumbest ones, the ones who confused danger with opportunity. But soon enough, more followed. They realized humans had invented blankets. Primitive, smelly blankets made from animal hides, yes, but soft enough when compared to sleeping on frozen dirt in the snow. Humans protested at first. They complained. They pushed the dogs away. Some tried to enforce boundaries. And then, when the temperature dropped to levels where, why are we alive, became a genuine philosophical question, they reluctantly pulled the dogs closer. Nothing warms a frigid shelter quite like a 50-pound fluffy space heater that occasionally snores. This was the moment when everything truly changed. Dogs started treating human camps not as feeding stations but as dens. Their dens, their homes, They guarded them without being asked. They growled at strangers who approached. They barked at weird noises in the darkness. They woke everyone up at 3 in the morning because a pine cone moved in a threatening way. Humans didn't realize it yet, but the domestication process was entirely finished. The dogs weren't living with humans. The humans were living with dogs, whether they fully acknowledged it or not. Dogs claimed the warmest sleeping spots, pushing humans to less comfortable areas. Dogs ate the best scraps, leaving humans with the less desirable portions. Dogs inserted themselves into family matters like furry diplomats, with no official credentials but enormous confidence. Dogs decided who could approach the camp and who absolutely could not. Dogs even tried to help with chores, which mostly resulted in chaos and confusion, but the effort was appreciated nonetheless. And the strangest part of all this? Humans didn't hate it, despite the fur everywhere, constantly shedding and covering everything, despite the constant barking that drove people to distraction, despite occasional stolen food and the absolute fact that dogs did not respect personal space in any way. Humans grew attached, emotionally, deeply. They began to care, because dogs did something no Ice Age human expected, something that seemed almost magical. They made life less miserable. The nights didn't feel quite so long and endless. The cold felt less cruel and oppressive, and for the first time in human history, someone greeted you with joy simply because you existed. Just you, walking into a shelter, and being welcomed with enthusiasm and affection. The partnership was sealed not by blood, not by ritual, not by formal agreement. It was sealed by warmth, leftovers, and loneliness, the 3 greatest forces in the ancient world. The end of one era, the beginning of another. As the Ice Age gradually thawed, and humanity collectively decided it preferred not dying of frostbite, civilization finally began to sprout and grow. Agriculture emerged, settlements formed, societies organized, and with civilization, dogs strutted right into the spotlight, like they were auditioning for a historical documentary. They had no idea what was coming, but they were ready, and nowhere did they shine brighter. Nowhere did they become more important or more celebrated than in ancient Egypt, the land of gold, gods, pyramids, and an alarming enthusiasm for shaving things. Egyptians took one look at dogs and said, "Yes, this creature clearly has divine potential," which is genuinely funny when you consider that dogs were still rolling in questionable substances and eating whatever fell on the ground. But the Egyptians admired loyalty, courage, and a good set of teeth, and dogs had all of these qualities in abundance. Unlike half the royal court, dogs guarded homes faithfully. They herded livestock with dedication. They accompanied hunters into marshes filled with hippos, crocodiles, and birds who looked like they held serious grudges against humanity. Egyptian hunters trusted their dogs more than their fellow nobles, and honestly, who could blame them? Egypt took dog appreciation to entirely new heights. Literally, they immortalized dogs in tomb paintings, creating beautiful, detailed images that would last for thousands of years. They carved dogs into statues made of stone and precious materials. They painted them on pottery with intricate designs. Some nobles, in displays of devotion that would seem excessive even by modern standards, had their dogs buried beside them so they could continue their duties in the afterlife. One wonders if they expected the dogs to continue peeing on sacred objects in the eternal realm. It's an amusing thought to contemplate as you drift toward sleep. And then there was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of death, embalming, and presumably "please don't haunt me." Egyptians claimed he wasn't technically based on dogs, but let's be honest with each other. Ancient Egyptian jackals looked suspiciously like street dogs with professional eyeliner applied with absolute precision. The divine message was crystal clear to anyone paying attention. Dogs were respected, dogs were feared, dogs were loved, and rumors suggested they worked part-time guiding souls into the underworld, which was quite the job description. Despite all this worship and reverence, Egyptians also had a terrible habit that seems bizarre to modern sensibilities. They shaved their dogs, not for cleanliness reasons, not for health purposes, but because bald dogs were considered fashionable. Imagine a majestic hunting dog, proud and skilled, with a beautiful coat that took generations to evolve. Now imagine that dog suddenly shaved until it resembled a confused, shivering rat with existential questions about why this was happening. That was Egyptian style. That was the height of fashion in the Nile Valley. Still, despite the questionable grooming choices, dogs in Egypt lived better lives than most peasants. They had names, they had collars made of fine materials, they had fan art created by talented artisans. Some even had funerals more elaborate than your average taxpayer could ever hope for. If reincarnation is real, and if you had to choose where to be reborn, you definitely wanted to come back as an Egyptian noble's dog, not as his servant, not as a peasant, as the dog. The hierarchy was clear. In Egypt, dogs were no longer just camp companions helping with survival. They were symbols of protection, friendship, loyalty, and the universal truth that was becoming increasingly obvious. Dogs were already humanity's best friends. Humans were just finally catching up to that reality. Philosophy, wisdom, and sleepy dogs. By the time dogs reached ancient Greece, they had already survived the Ice Age, found religion in Egypt, and were now ready to deal with something far more stressful and potentially exhausting. Greek philosophers. You see, wolves had once faced mammoths. Dogs had once faced starvation and the constant threat of death. But nothing prepared them for toga-wearing intellectuals trying to explain ethics for 6 hours straight while the dogs just wanted to nap. In Greece, dogs were everywhere. In workshops where craftspeople created beautiful objects, in marketplaces where merchants haggled endlessly, in gymnasiums where Greeks exercised constantly and obsessively, and most importantly, in philosophical schools where the greatest minds gathered to debate the nature of existence itself. And if you're wondering what dogs were doing in these philosophical schools, the answer is wonderfully simple: sleeping through lectures. Dogs have always understood something fundamental. The correct response to a man explaining the nature of truth is to take a comfortable nap and let the words wash over you like waves. Yet the Greeks admired dogs deeply, profoundly even. They saw dogs as symbols of loyalty, bravery, and moral clarity. Everything the average Athenian citizen lacked but desperately wanted to possess. Greek warriors used dogs for protection in battle. Farmers used them to guard their flocks from predators and thieves. Hunters used them to chase down prey across mountains and through forests. And philosophers used them as metaphors because apparently no discussion of virtue was complete without mentioning a good boy and his noble character. But the funniest part of Greek dog culture was this: there was an entire philosophical movement named after dogs, the Cynics. The word cynic literally means dog-like, and not because they were loyal, though some were. No, because they lived simply, barked at society's nonsense, refused to follow arbitrary rules, and occasionally peed in public to make a philosophical point about the absurdity of civilization. Dogs would have been proud. Socrates praised dogs for their ability to tell friend from enemy at a glance. Plato compared dogs to ideal guardians, creatures who could be trusted to protect the vulnerable. Aristotle claimed dogs had a form of practical wisdom, which is genuinely ironic considering this was an era when dogs still ate rocks for fun and seemed confused by their own reflections. Meanwhile, Greek households adored their dogs and treated them surprisingly well by ancient standards. They gave them names like Foxy, Whitey, Growler, and Blitzer, proving that humans have always been terrible at naming things, even when they try their best. Dogs lounged in courtyards during warm afternoons. They begged for food in tavern entrances, always hopeful. They inserted themselves into family life with zero boundaries and complete confidence. But Greek dogs also had real jobs. Serious work. They guarded temples with dedication. They herded goats across hillsides. They accompanied soldiers into battle, something Socrates politely declined to do, preferring his philosophical discussions to the chaos of warfare. In the classical world, dogs weren't just companions or workers. They were co-workers, bodyguards, sleep aids for bored philosophers listening to endless lectures, and furry symbols of everything humans wanted to be, but rarely achieved. And the Greeks understood one thing better than most ancient peoples: dogs live simply, love deeply, and judge silently, which makes them wiser than most philosophers who ever lived. This understanding would persist and echo through the centuries. When dogs reached ancient Rome, they discovered something genuinely terrifying: an empire that tried to militarize absolutely everything it encountered. If Rome could weaponize it, it did. If it couldn't weaponize it immediately, Rome conquered it anyway and wrote a detailed manual about why weaponizing it was a brilliant idea. Naturally, dogs didn't escape this treatment. Romans looked at dogs, loyal, fast, emotionally available, and trainable, and said, yes, perfect. Let's put armor on it. Enter the Roman war dog, an animal who definitely did not sign up for this particular job. These dogs, often massive mastiffs or Maloyan breeds that towered over most soldiers, marched alongside legions. They wore spiked collars and occasionally chainmail, creating an intimidating appearance that was almost cruel in its effectiveness. Imagine being a barbarian warrior, psyching yourself up for battle, preparing mentally for the clash of swords and the chaos of war, only to see a huge armored dog charging at you like the world's angriest kitchen appliance. It was effective psychological warfare. Roman commanders loved these dogs, not for their cuteness. That emotion was banned from the military establishment, but for their ability to intimidate enemies and bite things on command with startling precision. War dogs guarded camps through long nights. They delivered messages between commanders. They attacked intruders and invaders. And most importantly, they stole food from soldiers who were already starving, demonstrating a true multitasking ability that was both appreciated and deeply frustrating. But it wasn't all war and violence and intimidation in Roman society. Romans also adored dogs at home, in their private lives, away from the battlefield. Wealthy families kept lap dogs with names like Fiddle, Little One, and Bitey. These tiny dogs slept on silk cushions imported from distant lands. They ate scraps from banquets and definitely judged every guest who entered the villa with silent disapproval. Meanwhile, Roman soldiers on the frontier, far from home and lonely, shared their rations with giant shaggy dogs who smelled like battle and potatoes. There was affection there, genuine connection forged in the hardship of military life. Roman farmers used dogs to guard livestock from wolves and thieves. Merchants used them to protect caravans traveling dangerous roads. Even Roman priests used dogs during certain rituals, though the dogs probably had no idea why they were there and simply assumed it involved snacks. And of course, being Romans, they recorded everything meticulously. We have tombstones dedicated to beloved pets, complete with poetic inscriptions like, "I am in tears while carrying you to your last resting place, as much as I rejoiced when bringing you home in my own hands." A level of emotion Romans rarely showed to actual humans. It's touching to read these ancient tributes, these quiet declarations of love carved in stone. But the most ironic part of Roman culture was this: for all their glorification of war, conquest, and discipline, for all their pride in military strength and imperial power, Rome still bowed quietly and privately to the emotional power of dogs. A dog could guard an empire. A dog could march with legions. A dog could serve in battle with courage no senator ever possessed. Yet at night, after the fighting ended, even the toughest Roman soldier rested easier with a dog curled at his feet. Because in Rome, as everywhere else, dogs weren't just warriors or tools or status symbols. They were family. As the Roman Empire puffed itself up across Europe, expanding its territory and influence, And as the Greeks debated everything from ethics to the meaning of chairs, dogs were quietly doing something far more impressive than either of them. They were conquering the world without even trying. No strategy, no legions, no diplomacy, just pause, charm, and zero understanding of borders or political boundaries. The moment humanity built the Silk Road, that long, dusty highway stretching from China to the Mediterranean Sea, dogs looked at it and thought, "Nice, a walk." And off they went, traveling with merchants and caravans across deserts, over mountains, and through cities they'd never seen before. Wherever merchants traveled, across deserts filled with sand and scorpions, mountains filled with danger, and cities filled with strangers, dogs followed, sometimes intentionally, sometimes because a merchant dropped a dumpling and the dog decided to investigate, sometimes because a dog woke up from a nap and realized it was 600 miles from home and simply rolled with it, accepting the adventure. Caravans heading from China to Persia had the same three constants: camels complaining about the journey, merchants complaining louder than the camels, and dogs who complained about nothing but still ate the most. Dogs became the Silk Road's unofficial employees. They guarded tents at night against thieves and predators. They chased thieves away from valuable merchandise. They scared off animals that wanted to eat the merchandise. Traders learned one important truth that transcended language barriers: you can trust a dog more than a business partner. Different cultures began swapping more than just silk and spices on these routes. They swapped dog breeds. A Persian trader might meet a Chinese caravan and see a fluffy little dog and think, "My wife will either love this or throw it at me." And suddenly, Pekingese dogs were traveling across continents like tiny grumpy diplomats carrying cultural exchange in their fluffy bodies. Meanwhile, hardy shepherd dogs from Central Asia moved westward, joining nomads and guarding livestock from wolves who apparently hadn't read the memo that dogs were now on Team Human. Every stop on the Silk Road added another chapter to the story. In India, dogs found temples to guard and leftovers to steal. In Persia, they protected caravans and pretended to be noble. In Central Asia, they befriended horsemen with zero fear of death. In China, they became pampered palace pets who absolutely judged everyone around them with aristocratic disdain. Dogs didn't just spread biologically across continents. They spread culturally, carrying stories and traditions with them. People shared stories about them around fires. Merchants traded them as valuable gifts. Kings demanded them as gifts from distant lands. Entire populations reshaped how they saw wolves because of dogs that wandered great empires, sniffing everything in sight and leaving paw prints of history behind them. By the time the Silk Road reached full swing as a major trading network, dogs had accomplished something truly extraordinary. They became the first global citizens, connecting cultures and continents. And they did it by following people who dropped crumbs. While humans mapped trade routes, built empires, and fought over territory, dogs simply existed, and somehow that was enough to take over the world. As civilization got richer, fatter, and more obsessed with showing off wealth and status, dogs entered a new era, the status symbol era. This was when dogs stopped being just hunters, guards, or walking alarm systems keeping watch over property. Now they were luxury items, fashion accessories, living proof that your social standing was so high you could afford a creature that did absolutely nothing except look beautiful. In wealthy Greek households, owning a fancy dog was the ancient equivalent of posting a picture of your sports car on Instagram with a caption about how well you're doing. The more exotic the breed, the more people assumed you had a ridiculous amount of money and zero real problems to worry about. Aristocrats strutted through markets with elegant, fluffy dogs at their heels, while the dogs themselves looked constantly confused by their new environment. Why are there marble statues everywhere? Why is everyone yelling about democracy? Why do I have to wear this ridiculous collar? But Rome took this concept to Olympic levels of excess and showiness. Roman nobles kept toy dogs so tiny they could fit inside sleeves. Dogs that, evolutionarily speaking, had absolutely no business existing. These miniature trembling creatures didn't hunt anything. They didn't guard anything. They didn't bark effectively. Their primary job was to sit on silk pillows and look judgmental. Many succeeded admirably at this task. Meanwhile, professional dog breeders emerged, creating dogs specifically for wealthy households. These breeders probably invented half of the modern dog problems we still deal with today. Overbred noses that made breathing difficult, fragile bones prone to breaking, anxiety disorders inherited from 1,000 generations of palace gossip. It wasn't just small dogs, though. Wealthy elites loved massive dogs too, enormous Maloyan beasts that could guard estates and intimidate rivals, dogs so large they could accidentally crush your furniture just by lying down. Owning one was the ancient version of saying, "I have power. Also, I may die if it sits on me." Dogs also started appearing in art with increasing frequency. Every self-respecting noble wanted their portrait painted with a dog at their side, proof of sophistication, loyalty, and emotional depth. Although based on surviving sculptures, some nobles clearly loved their dogs more than their spouses. As empire after empire adopted dog culture, one thing became abundantly clear. Dogs weren't just animals anymore. They were social markers, political statements, symbols of taste and wealth and refinement, and occasionally delusion. The dog who once hunted mammoths now lounged in marble villas, eating roasted duck prepared by servants. The wolf who once survived by chasing deer now survived by being adorable enough to avoid banishment. And humanity didn't mind at all. Nothing says, "I am wealthy and important," quite like a creature who contributes nothing and still gets treated like royalty. What's remarkable about dogs in this era is how they reflected the values of each civilization that embraced them. In Egypt, where organization and hierarchy were paramount, dogs took on roles of protection and divine significance. In Greece, where philosophy and wisdom were cherished, dogs became symbols of virtue and moral clarity. In Rome, where military might and power ruled everything, dogs became warriors and symbols of strength. Dogs didn't change fundamentally. Rather, each society projected its own values onto them, and dogs, in their remarkable adaptability, seemed to accept these roles as naturally as they accepted the food and shelter provided. Dogs in this period also became excellent teachers of human nature. They demonstrated loyalty without expecting reward. They showed courage without seeking glory. They gave affection without demanding recognition. For humans struggling with greed, ambition, and the endless pursuit of power, dogs served as quiet reminders of simpler, more noble virtues. A peasant watching a dog defend its family against a predator saw pure courage. A philosopher watching a dog rest peacefully saw contentment and acceptance of fate. A merchant watching a dog protect his goods saw honor and reliability. Each observer saw in dogs what their own culture valued most. The development of different dog breeds during this period reflected the sophistication of ancient societies. Greyhounds, prized for their speed and grace, were beloved by hunters who appreciated athletic prowess. Mastiffs, massive and powerful, appealed to those who valued strength and intimidation. Small lapdogs, fragile and delicate, appealed to those with the leisure time to care for creatures that couldn't fend for themselves. Each breed served a purpose, and each breed told a story about the people who developed them. The role of dogs in facilitating trade cannot be overstated. Beyond their practical value as guards and companions, dogs also served as cultural ambassadors. When a Chinese merchant traded a Pekingese to a Persian lord, that dog carried with it stories of a distant civilization. The dog's appearance, temperament, and behavior were all foreign and fascinating. Other merchants who saw this exotic dog would inquire about its origins, leading to conversations about distant lands and different ways of living. Dogs also made travel safer and more bearable. A merchant traveling the Silk Road faced many dangers: bandits, wild animals, treacherous terrain, and the constant threat of disease. A dog provided psychological comfort beyond its practical protection. A loyal dog sleeping nearby meant you weren't completely alone in the darkness. A dog that barked at approaching strangers gave you warning and time to prepare. A dog's presence was grounding, a reminder of home and familiarity, even when you were thousands of miles away in a foreign land. The relationships between traders and their dogs often lasted years, spanning multiple journeys across continents. A merchant might set out with the same dog for 5 or 6 journeys, and that dog became part of his identity. Other merchants would recognize him by his dog. Locals would remember him as the man with the loyal hound. In a world without photographs or identification papers, dogs served as recognizable markers of identity. Dogs in religious and spiritual contexts. Beyond their practical and symbolic roles, dogs held deep spiritual significance in many ancient cultures. In Egypt, as we discussed, Anubis represented the bridge between life and death. But in other cultures, dogs held equally important spiritual roles. In Greece, dogs were associated with Hecate, goddess of magic and the crossroads. In Rome, dogs were linked to various gods and goddesses. This spiritual dimension added another layer of reverence and respect to the human-dog relationship. Dogs also served in religious ceremonies and rituals across multiple civilizations. Priests and priestesses recognized that dogs had an intuitive understanding of spiritual matters. A dog that refused to enter a temple might be seen as a sign that something was spiritually wrong. A dog that seemed calm and peaceful during a ritual might be interpreted as divine approval. Dogs became tools for spiritual practitioners, helping them interpret signs and communicate with the divine. The practice of burying dogs with their masters, particularly common in Egypt but also seen in other civilizations, reflected a belief that the human-dog bond transcended death itself. Humans wanted their dogs with them in the afterlife. They wanted the same loyalty, the same companionship, the same comfort in the eternal realm that they had experienced in life. This wasn't mere superstition. It was a profound recognition of what dogs meant to human existence. What made dogs so universally valued across all these ancient civilizations was their mastery of a language that transcended words. Dogs communicated through body language, through their presence, through actions rather than words. A dog didn't need to speak Greek or Latin or Egyptian to understand it's human. A dog knew when someone was sad, not through explanation but through intuition and observation. This unwritten language made dogs invaluable in societies where language barriers existed. A Roman soldier stationed in Egypt could communicate with a local dog more easily than with a local human who didn't speak Latin. A Chinese merchant in Persia could find comfort in a dog that didn't speak Persian, but understood the universal language of loyalty and affection. Dogs also served as social lubricants, facilitating connection between humans who might otherwise have remained distant or suspicious of each other. A shared appreciation for a dog could bridge cultural divides. An Egyptian noble and a visiting Greek merchant might find common ground in discussing their mutual admiration for a particularly fine hunting dog. That common ground could lead to trade agreements, diplomatic ties, and genuine friendship. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of dogs in ancient civilizations is how they served as mirrors reflecting human values and aspirations. When Socrates praised dogs for their ability to distinguish friend from enemy, he was praising a quality he believed humanity needed more of. When Roman generals used war dogs, they were trying to embody the qualities they saw in dogs: loyalty, fierceness, and unwavering commitment to duty. Dogs became measuring sticks against which humans evaluated themselves. If a dog could be so loyal despite receiving minimal care, what did that say about human loyalty? If a dog could forgive humans for mistreating it, What did that say about human capacity for forgiveness? If a dog could love unconditionally despite not understanding complex human language, what did that say about the barriers humans erected that prevented love? These questions weren't asked explicitly, but they hung in the air around every human-dog interaction. And slowly, through contact with dogs, humans began to understand something fundamental about themselves and about what really mattered in life. So far in our journey through time, we've watched dogs transform from desperate scavengers into beloved companions, from useful hunters into divine symbols, from simple animals into status symbols and treasured family members. We've seen them in palaces and temples, in military camps and merchant caravans, in the homes of the wealthy and alongside the poor. Each civilization added its own layer to the story, its own way of appreciating and celebrating these remarkable creatures. Dogs learned to navigate multiple worlds. They could be fierce warriors in battle and gentle companions in home. They could be sacred symbols in temples and practical workers in fields. They could be toys for the wealthy and survival partners for the poor. This adaptability was perhaps their greatest gift. As we prepare to move forward into the medieval world, into a time of knights and castles and a very different kind of society, hold on to this thought. Dogs have remained constant through all of it. Through the rise and fall of empires, through wars and conquests, through centuries of change and transformation. They've been there, loyal and faithful, adapting to each new world they found themselves in, each new culture they encountered, and the bond between humans and dogs has only grown stronger, deeper, more meaningful with each passing age. From the Ice Age fires to the marble halls of Rome, from the temples of Egypt to the philosophical schools of Greece, the story remains the same. Dogs chose to stay, humans chose to welcome them, and together they created something beautiful, something that would endure for millennia to come, something that continues to this very day, in homes around the world, as humans and dogs find comfort in each other's presence. Welcome back, dear friend. We're settling deeper into our story now, moving forward through time into a period where dogs would experience a profound split in their existence. The medieval world was a place of stark contrasts, between the powerful and the powerless, between castle walls and muddy villages, between luxury and survival. And in this world, dogs too would find themselves living in two completely different realities. Let me paint you a picture of the medieval period. It was a time when the average peasant's life expectancy hovered somewhere between "don't get your hopes up and the plague is coming again." If you were poor, which was essentially everyone except 3 people and the local bishop, your daily routine was brutally simple. Work from sunrise to the moment you physically couldn't work anymore. Eat bread that could genuinely break your teeth if you weren't careful. Try desperately not to catch a disease that starts with a cough and ends with burial in an unmarked grave. It was a harsh world, unforgiving and difficult. In this chaos and hardship, dogs became indispensable. Not as luxury ornaments or status symbols, that was still the domain of nobility, not as subjects of philosophical debate, but as actual survival equipment, practical, necessary, essential to daily life. The medieval peasant had exactly 3 lines of defense against the various disasters that constantly threatened. A wooden door that didn't close properly and had gaps you could see daylight through, prayer and hope that someone was listening, and a dog that barked at absolutely everything, regardless of whether it was actually dangerous or just wind moving through the village. Medieval watchdogs were not the glamorous warriors of Roman legions. They were not the pampered companions of Egyptian nobles. They were scruffy, muddy, vaguely potato-shaped creatures who smelled like compost and bad decisions. Their coats were matted. Their demeanor was uncertain. But they were loyal, alert, and always ready to sound the alarm, even if the danger was just a leaf blowing suspiciously in the breeze. These dogs roamed village fences, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. They guarded livestock with dedication that was sometimes almost excessive. They escorted peasants home from long days in the fields, tired work that left everyone exhausted. They weren't pampered, they weren't brushed. They certainly weren't fed high-quality medieval kibble. Their diet consisted largely of table scraps, stale bread, and things they found on the ground that no one talks about, and probably shouldn't think about too closely. Yet, medieval peasants adored them in their own way. A dog might sleep by the hearth, a generous word for a pile of burning sticks and embers that provided warmth and occasionally singed fur. A dog would warm the children during winter nights when the cold tried to steal heat from small bodies. A dog would chase off thieves desperate enough to rob someone who owned literally nothing of value. Dogs were essentially furry housemates who kept predators at bay. Wolves, foxes, or occasionally the drunk knight who fell asleep in the wrong cottage and woke up confused and dangerous. But the partnership was mutual, fair in its own way. Dogs got warmth from human company and proximity. They got a human family to belong to. They got a reliable food source, even if the food tasted like disappointment and smelled suspicious. They also got affection, not fancy collars or velvet cushions, but pats on the head, gentle words, and a life free from the brutal pack politics of wild wolves fighting for dominance and survival. Medieval dogs worked for their living. There's no way around it. They herded sheep across muddy pastures, their natural instincts guiding the flocks toward grazing grounds. They guarded granaries where precious grain was stored, standing watch through long nights against thieves and hungry animals. They patrolled muddy roads with the seriousness of a knight defending his honor. Except knights usually smelled better and complained less about the mud. In the hierarchy of village life, peasants sat at the bottom, viewed as little better than property themselves. But dogs were somewhere just above peasants and below the local priest. And honestly, they earned that position. They proved their worth every single day through loyalty and service. Because while medieval Europe battled plague, famine, taxes, raiders, and more plague, these loyal animals stayed by humanity's side. They barked their hopeless little barks into the darkness. They stood their ground against predators. They refused to abandon their posts, no matter how cold or uncomfortable the conditions became. And somehow, it helped. Having a dog nearby made the darkness less terrifying. Having a dog protect your livestock meant you might eat tomorrow. Having a dog warn you of approaching danger meant you might live another day. If medieval peasants had dogs for survival, then medieval nobles had dogs for something far more dramatic and interesting: status, ego, political power, and emotional support during the constant political meltdowns that characterized noble life. Dogs in castles lived such a different existence from village dogs that you might reasonably think they were entirely separate species that happened to share the same name. Peasant dogs slept on dirt floors. Noble dogs slept on cushions stuffed with goose feathers and the suffering of the lower classes. Peasant dogs ate scraps. Noble dogs ate meat prepared specifically for them. Peasant dogs wore nothing. Noble dogs wore collars of fine leather adorned with jewels. The contrast was stark and absolute. Castle life, the other side of the medieval world. Castles were chaotic places filled with constant activity and tension. Scheming nobles tried to outmaneuver each other politically. Bored knights looked for entertainment and glory. Moody princes demanded attention and service. And somewhere in the middle of it all, at least one suspiciously unhinged jester provided commentary on everything. Into this medieval soap opera entered the castle hound. Massive, muscular, loyal, and usually better behaved than every single human in the building. Nobles loved hunting, mostly because it gave them an excellent excuse to avoid governing and to escape the suffocating politics of castle life. Their hounds were absolutely essential for these hunting expeditions. These dogs were trained to track boar through forests, to chase deer across open meadows, and to ignore the existential screams of peasants watching their livestock vanish into the woods yet again, claimed by the hunting party. Castle hounds were serious professionals, unlike the nobles who owned them. Picture a hunting scene in your mind. A noble knight in a shiny helmet he can't see out of, bumping into things. A group of servants doing all the actual work of organizing and managing the hunt, and a pack of hounds sprinting ahead thinking, finally, someone is letting us do our job, instead of forcing us to sit through another tedious banquet where we have to pretend to be interested in political intrigue. These hounds were elite, strong, fast, loyal beyond measure. They guarded castles during the night, their presence a deterrent to anyone foolish enough to attempt a nighttime raid. They patrolled courtyards, looking for intruders. They politely refrained from eating messengers most of the time, which was appreciated. Some castles even had entire rooms dedicated to dogs, rooms warmer than the servants' quarters naturally. The priorities of medieval nobility were interesting. Meanwhile, noble ladies kept smaller dogs, delicate little creatures who spent their days on velvet cushions, receiving more affection than most husbands ever got. These miniature dogs never hunted anything. They never guarded anything of importance. They never contributed anything except the occasional dramatic fainting spell. They were, in essence, medieval influencers before that concept even existed. They were there to look beautiful, to be admired, to justify the wealth and leisure of their owners. Dogs in the noble world were also emotional anchors for people living under constant stress. Knights heading to war hugged their dogs goodbye, not knowing if they would return. Lords confided in dogs, telling them secrets they could never tell another human. Queens fed them scraps under the table during political dinners where everyone pretended to like each other while actually plotting against each other. Dogs understood palace secrets better than the royal scribes, and they could keep those secrets too, never betraying a confidence. The duality of medieval dog life. The real comedy in all of this, and there was comedy despite the darkness, was that no matter how fancy their surroundings, no matter how expensive their collars or how luxurious their cushions, castle dogs still behaved like dogs. They chased chickens. They stole bread from tables. They barked at ghosts that didn't exist. They refused to come when called because even wrapped in luxury, a dog will always be a dog. There's a fundamental dogness that can't be refined away or trained out, no matter how many generations of breeding you attempt. And medieval nobles needed that kind of honest chaos more than they ever admitted. In a world where every word, every gesture, every meal could be a carefully orchestrated move in a game of political chess, dogs offered something real. Dogs didn't play games. Dogs didn't scheme. Dogs didn't pretend to like you while secretly hating you. Dogs simply were what they were, loyal and present and genuinely happy to see you. For nobles drowning in courtly politics, that authenticity was more valuable than gold. The contrast between the lives of peasant dogs and noble dogs speaks volumes about medieval society. The same species, the same basic needs, but vastly different experiences based entirely on birth and circumstance. A peasant's dog might work from dawn to dusk, protecting livestock. A noble's dog might never work a day in its life, existing purely for companionship and status. Yet both types of dogs served essential functions in their respective worlds. Both were loved in their own ways. Both formed bonds with their humans that transcended the hierarchies and social structures that defined medieval life. A peasant woman might love her working dog no less than a noble lady loved her lapdog. The quality of love didn't diminish because the circumstances were different. By the time Europe stumbled into the Renaissance, the medieval period was slowly giving way to something new. Humans had rediscovered art, science, architecture, and philosophy. They were looking backward to classical times for inspiration and forward to new possibilities simultaneously. And in the midst of this transformation, dogs continued to occupy their dual positions, both working animals and beloved companions, both practical tools and emotional supports. The Renaissance would take dog appreciation to new heights, developing new breeds, creating new forms of art featuring dogs, and generally spoiling dogs even more than the nobility had already done. But that's a story for later in our journey. For now, as you drift deeper into sleep, let these images of medieval dogs settle in your mind. Dogs in smoky castles, dogs in muddy villages, dogs barking in the darkness, dogs providing warmth and comfort and safety in a world that was often cold and dangerous. What's important to understand about this period is that dogs were adapting to the world humans created. In agrarian medieval society where survival was the primary concern, dogs became survival tools. In a society where status and display mattered tremendously to the nobility, dogs became status symbols. Dogs didn't change fundamentally. Rather, they found roles to fill in every segment of society, every level of the hierarchy. This adaptability was perhaps their greatest strength. Unlike humans, who were locked into their social positions by birth and circumstance, dogs could move between worlds. A dog could be a peasant's working animal in the daytime, and, if circumstances changed, could find itself in a noble's castle by nighttime. Dogs didn't judge themselves based on their circumstances. They simply accepted where they were and did what needed to be done. In the medieval world, dogs learned to navigate two completely different realities. They learned to work in fields and sleep on floors. They also learned to sit in castles and sleep on cushions. They learned to bark warnings in villages and to pursue game in forests for noble lords. They learned to comfort peasants and to accompany knights. They learned that life could be harsh and difficult or comfortable and leisurely, but through it all, they remained what they had always been: loyal, dedicated, and willing to serve. The medieval period, for all its darkness and difficulty, saw dogs firmly establish themselves as essential to human existence at every level of society. Not as luxuries, though they could be that. Not as mere tools, though they were certainly useful. But as genuine participants in human life, accepted and valued, necessary and loved. There's something deeply moving about the medieval period's relationship with dogs when you consider the context. In a world where everything was uncertain, where death could come suddenly from disease or violence, where loyalty was rare and often betrayed, dogs offered something stable. Dogs offered a kind of loyalty that was absolute and uncomplicated. A dog didn't care about your social status. A dog didn't care about your political allegiances. A dog cared that you existed and that you might offer food and shelter. This simple, uncomplicated loyalty was revolutionary in a way. It suggested that loyalty didn't require complex reasons or political calculations. It could exist in its purest form, motivated by nothing more than affection and the desire for companionship. Medieval people, living lives of such difficulty and uncertainty, understood this intuitively. They recognized in dogs something noble and true, something worth protecting and cherishing. Even peasants, who had almost nothing, protected their dogs and gave them space in their limited resources. Even nobles, who had everything, seemed to treasure their dogs in ways that sometimes exceeded their affection for other people. As we move forward in our journey, remember these images: the peasant woman warming herself by a fire with a dog at her side, the noble child playing with a small dog in a castle courtyard, the hunter trusting his life to his dog in a dangerous forest. These images span centuries and represent a consistent truth. Dogs have earned their place in human history, not through conquest or politics, but through loyal service and genuine affection. And that affection has been returned time and time again across every era and every culture. From Ice Age fires to medieval castles, dogs have remained constant companions, and humans, despite our flaws and complications, have welcomed them. During the medieval period, humans began to truly understand selective breeding in ways they hadn't before. The Romans had bred dogs for specific purposes, but medieval nobles took this to new levels of specialization and refinement. They wanted hunting dogs, that were faster than their neighbors' hunting dogs. They wanted guard dogs that were more intimidating than their rivals' guard dogs. They wanted lap dogs that were smaller and more delicate than anyone else's lap dogs. This selective breeding created a remarkable diversity of dog types by the end of the medieval period. There were hunting dogs bred specifically for different types of prey, greyhounds for chasing fast animals across open ground, mastiffs for taking down larger creatures, spaniels for flushing birds from bushes, scent hounds for tracking prey through forests. Each type was refined and developed over generations, with careful attention to breeding records and lineage. Medieval monasteries played an interesting role in dog breeding as well. Monks, with their organized approach to animal husbandry and their long-term thinking, developed several important dog breeds. They kept detailed records of bloodlines. They made deliberate choices about which dogs to breed together. They developed dogs that served the monastery's specific needs: guard dogs for protection, hunting dogs for food, and companion dogs for emotional comfort during the difficult monastic life. This careful approach to breeding meant that by the end of the medieval period, dogs had become incredibly diverse. You could tell someone's status and occupation by the type of dog they kept. A wealthy merchant might own a specific type of hunting dog. A knight might own a massive mastiff. A lady might own a delicate spaniel. A peasant might own a mixed breed that was good at everything and specialized in nothing. Dogs in medieval religion and superstition. Medieval Christianity had a complicated relationship with dogs. On one hand, there were saints associated with dogs. Saint Roch, for instance, was supposedly aided by a dog during his travels. Saint Bernard of Menthon, the patron saint of mountain climbers, was associated with the large dogs bred by monks in the Alps. These Saint Bernard dogs became famous for rescuing travelers lost in mountain snowstorms, carrying small kegs of brandy around their necks in popular legend. On the other hand, medieval Christianity sometimes viewed dogs with suspicion. Dogs were seen as unclean animals in some Christian texts. There were superstitions about certain dogs being bad omens. A black dog appearing at night might be seen as demonic. Yet despite these superstitions, dogs remained firmly embedded in medieval life and medieval faith. Priests and monks kept dogs. Bishops blessed dogs. Dogs were buried in churchyards, though sometimes this was controversial because some theologians questioned whether dogs had souls worthy of such honor. Yet the practice continued anyway, suggesting that the emotional bond between humans and dogs transcended theological debate. Medieval bestiaries, illustrated manuscripts describing real and mythical animals, often featured dogs prominently. These bestiaries served educational purposes, teaching people about the natural world and also embedding moral lessons. Dogs in these texts were usually portrayed as symbols of loyalty, faithfulness, and devotion. The bestiary tradition helped embed the idea of dogs as noble and virtuous creatures into medieval consciousness. The role of dogs in medieval justice. Interestingly, dogs sometimes played roles in medieval justice systems. There are records of trial by dog, where guilt or innocence might be determined by how a dog reacted to an accused person. If the dog barked and attacked the accused, that was taken as evidence of guilt. This seems absurd to modern sensibilities, but it reflects how much medieval people trusted dogs' instincts and judgment. Dogs were also sometimes used in medieval warfare in ways beyond the famous war dogs of history. A dog might carry messages between parts of an army. A dog might scout ahead of troops to detect ambushes. A dog might simply serve as a morale booster for soldiers facing dangerous combat. The psychological value of having a dog with your army unit was significant. Medieval knights sometimes went into battle with their beloved dogs, not for tactical purposes but for personal reasons. A knight might want his dog with him because that dog was his closest friend. A knight might trust his dog's loyalty more than he trusted his squire or fellow knights. This speaks to the depth of emotional connection that could exist between medieval people and their dogs. Life wasn't easy for medieval dogs, whether peasant or noble. Disease was common, Many dogs didn't survive to adulthood. Infections, parasites, and injuries took their toll. Medieval people had very limited understanding of veterinary medicine. They did what they could with herbal remedies and prayer, but often a sick or injured dog would simply die. Nutrition was another challenge. Even noble dogs sometimes suffered from nutritional deficiencies. Peasant dogs often survived on scraps that barely kept them alive. Yet dogs adapted remarkably well to these harsh conditions. Their genetic flexibility meant they could survive on diets that would have killed less adaptable animals. Medieval dogs also had to deal with constant parasites. Fleas, lice, and worms were probably present on most dogs. Without modern flea and worm treatments, these parasites could become severe problems. Yet dogs persisted, scratching and uncomfortable sometimes, but still loyal and still working. Injuries were common too. A hunting dog might return from a hunt with serious wounds from boar tusks or other hazards. A guard dog protecting livestock might be injured fighting off a predator. Medieval people would do what they could to treat these injuries, using bandages, poultices, and prayers. Some dogs recovered, others didn't. The ones that did developed scars and tough attitudes, becoming even more intimidating to potential intruders or prey animals. What's remarkable about medieval human-dog relationships is how deep they went despite the harsh conditions. Medieval literature, though sparse on this topic, occasionally mentions bonds between specific people and specific dogs. There are references to knights mourning their dogs, references to nobles being devastated when their beloved dogs died, references to peasants spending precious resources to care for sick or injured dogs. This suggests that the medieval period, for all its harshness and difficulty, saw the development of profound emotional connections between humans and dogs. These connections weren't always practical or economically rational. A peasant had no practical reason to waste resources on an injured dog that couldn't work, yet many peasants did so anyway. A noble had many options for entertainment and companionship, yet nobles often seemed to prefer their dogs to more prestigious human company. The medieval period solidified something that had been developing for centuries, the idea that dogs were more than property or tools. They were companions, friends, family members. This idea would only grow stronger in the periods to come. Medieval people developed a genuine understanding of dog behavior and temperament. They knew that different dogs had different personalities. They recognized that individual dogs could be brave or cowardly, intelligent or simple, affectionate or aloof. They developed breeds specifically to enhance certain temperamental traits. They understood, in practical if not scientific terms, how dogs thought and how they communicated. This understanding made medieval people better at working with dogs. Hunters could read their dogs' behavior and know when they had caught a scent. Shepherds could direct their dogs with subtle gestures and commands. Guard dogs learned to recognize which people belonged in a space and which didn't. Dogs and humans developed communication systems that worked without extensive training, based on mutual understanding developed through years of living together. Medieval nobility, in particular, developed sophisticated understandings of dog behavior. They wrote about it occasionally. They discussed it among themselves. They made decisions about breeding based on behavioral traits, not just physical characteristics. This knowledge was passed down through generations, accumulating and becoming more refined. By the end of the medieval period, dogs existed everywhere, in cities and villages, in castles and hovels, in forests and fields. They had adapted to every environment human inhabited. They had found roles in every social class. They had become so thoroughly woven into human life that it was impossible to imagine medieval society without them. Dogs had proven their worth beyond any doubt. They were useful, they were loyal, they were adaptable, they were affectionate. They brought joy into difficult lives. They added meaning to existence. They were there in moments of celebration and in moments of grief. The medieval period was crucial in solidifying the human-dog relationship. It transformed dogs from animals that lived with humans into animals that were genuinely part of human society at every level. Medieval people of all classes came to depend on dogs, to love dogs, to value dogs in ways that would persist for centuries. As we move into the Renaissance and beyond, remember the medieval period. Remember the peasant woman, warming herself by a fire with a loyal dog. Remember the noble lady with her delicate lapdog. Remember the hunter and his dog working together in forests. Remember the guard dog standing watch through the night. These images represent something true and fundamental about the human-dog relationship that transcends time and circumstance. It's a bond built on loyalty, affection, and mutual benefit, and it's one of the most beautiful relationships in human history. As the Renaissance began to bloom across Europe, bringing with it a rediscovery of classical learning, an explosion of artistic achievement, and a general sense that humanity had finally figured out some important things, something interesting happened with dogs. They became more than ever before, more refined, more specialized, more celebrated, more beloved, more everything. This was the age of genius, where Michelangelo sculpted gods from marble, where Leonardo sketched helicopters centuries before they would actually exist, where human creativity seemed to know no bounds. But Renaissance nobles, in their own way, invented something truly revolutionary, the extremely pampered lapdog. This wasn't just a small dog that sat on your lap. This was a new category of creature entirely. A dog that had been so selectively bred, so carefully developed over generations, that it barely resembled the wild wolves from which it descended. These tiny velvet pillow creatures didn't descend from wolves so much as they descended from anxiety itself, distilled into furry form. They trembled constantly, as if perpetually startled by their own existence. They demanded attention with the intensity of a toddler who had just discovered they could scream. They had to be carried everywhere because their legs were apparently decorative rather than functional. These miniature dogs couldn't hunt. They couldn't guard. They couldn't do any of the practical things that dogs had done for millennia. Their primary and only job was to sit on silk pillows and look judgmental while being adorable. Ladies of high society absolutely adored them. A noble woman would glide through a Renaissance palace wearing 40 pounds of silk and brocade, her hair stacked higher than her social expectations, and at her side would be a 4-pound dog that looked like it hadn't hunted anything larger than a crouton in its entire existence. This dog would be dressed in miniature clothing. It would be groomed constantly. It would be fed the finest food, warmed by the finest fires, petted by the finest hands. This dog ate better than 98% of the population and contributed absolutely nothing beyond being cute enough to justify its existence. And yet everyone accepted this arrangement without question. The dog was valuable precisely because it was useless. It was a living proof of wealth and leisure. Only someone with tremendous resources could afford to keep an animal that required constant care and contributed nothing productive to society. Yet, the Renaissance wasn't entirely about tiny lapdogs trembling on velvet cushions. This was also a golden age for hunting, and hunting required dogs that were the opposite of tiny and delicate. Kings and dukes bred enormous, elegant hounds designed to sprint after deer at speeds that made knights seriously rethink their cardiovascular fitness routines. These hunting dogs were athletes, bred for power and endurance, and the ability to pursue prey for hours without tiring. Hunting was no longer strictly practical, a necessity for survival as it had been for peasants. For Renaissance nobility, hunting was performance art. It was theater. It was an excuse to display wealth, power, and sophistication. A Renaissance hunting party was as much about showing off as it was about actually catching anything. Men in tights would chase deer while dogs did all the real work. The aesthetic was everything. The performance mattered more than the outcome. It was a Renaissance aesthetic through and through. Meanwhile, artists became obsessed with painting dogs. Portraits of noble families almost always included a dog sitting proudly at their feet. looking more dignified than half the people in the room. Dogs appeared in religious paintings as symbols of loyalty and virtue. Dogs appeared in hunting scenes as central elements of the composition. In these paintings, dogs symbolized loyalty, virtue, and a kind of moral clarity that was supposed to reflect on the humans they accompanied. And then there were the weird little spaniels who sat in ladies' laps during long carriage rides, at balls, at banquets, during political negotiations, and during marriages arranged by people who absolutely shouldn't have been in charge of such important decisions. These dogs served a crucial Renaissance function that shouldn't be underestimated. They kept their owners from having a public meltdown. They provided a physical anchor to reality when things got too overwhelming. Royal courts were full of drama, betrayal, gossip, poisoning attempts, and fashion disasters so severe they barely deserved the name fashion. Having a tiny dog on your lap gave you at least one reason not to flip a banquet table in anger or frustration. A tiny dog was a responsibility, a life that depended on you, something that demanded care and attention even when you were furious or devastated or heartbroken. In this way, lapdogs were surprisingly therapeutic for Renaissance nobility. Renaissance artists developed a particular skill in portraying dogs. They understood that a dog's portrait could communicate status and personality simultaneously. A large hunting dog indicated that the owner was wealthy enough to maintain such an animal and active enough to participate in hunting expeditions. A small lapdog indicated that the owner had leisure time and resources to spare on a purely ornamental creature. But beyond the status signaling, Renaissance artists genuinely seemed to appreciate dogs as subjects. They captured the character in a dog's eyes. They showed the loyalty in a dog's posture. They rendered the texture of fur with incredible detail. Some Renaissance dog portraits are so beautifully executed, so full of life and personality, that you feel you know the individual dog centuries after its death. These paintings weren't just documentation or status symbols, though they were both of those things. They were also genuine expressions of affection and appreciation. An artist spending a week creating a detailed portrait of a noble's dog was, in a sense, creating a memorial to love and companionship. These paintings said, "This dog mattered. This dog was important enough to be remembered forever." During the Renaissance, dog breeding began to become more scientific, or at least more systematized. Breeders started keeping detailed records of bloodlines. They made deliberate choices about which dogs to breed together and why. They began to understand, in practical if not scientific terms, how traits were inherited and how they could be emphasized or diminished through selective breeding. This scientific approach led to the development of many dog breeds that we still recognize today. Renaissance breeders created dogs specifically for hunting different types of prey. They created dogs specifically for companionship. They created dogs with specific temperaments, specific sizes, specific appearances. They were essentially designing dogs to fit specific roles in society. This breeding work was taken very seriously by Renaissance nobility. Breeders were valued and well paid. Bloodlines were carefully tracked. Dogs with excellent bloodlines could be as expensive as horses. Some noble families became famous for breeding particularly excellent dogs. Their dogs were gifts worthy of kings. Dogs from prestigious breeders were traded between courts as symbols of alliance and friendship. Yet this intensive breeding also began to create problems that would persist for centuries. Overbred noses that made breathing difficult, fragile bones prone to breaking, anxiety disorders that seemed to be inherited alongside physical traits. Dogs developed health problems that were the direct result of humans trying to maximize certain traits at the expense of overall health and wellness. But Renaissance breeders focused on creating the perfect hunting dog or the most adorable lap dog, didn't necessarily think about these long-term consequences. What's particularly interesting about Renaissance dogs is how they fit into the emotional landscape of the era. The Renaissance was a time of great achievement, but also great tension. Artists competed with each other. Nobles competed for favor. Everyone was trying to be the smartest, the most talented, the most sophisticated. It was exhausting, it was cutthroat, it was also incredibly creative and dynamic. In this high-stress environment, dogs provided something stable. Dogs didn't compete. Dogs didn't judge talent. Dogs didn't participate in the endless social posturing. Dogs simply offered affection and companionship and presence. For people living in this tense, competitive environment, that simplicity was invaluable. There are stories of Renaissance artists developing deep bonds with their dogs. Artists who would sketch their dogs repeatedly, trying to capture their essence. Artists who would discuss their dogs in their journals with more emotional depth than they discussed other people. Dogs became muses in a way, objects of affection that didn't demand anything except presence and feeding and occasional petting. During the Renaissance and the subsequent centuries, the idea of displaying dogs competitively began to develop. This was the precursor to modern dog shows, though the organized competitions we know today didn't really exist yet. Still, there was a growing practice of nobles gathering to compare their dogs, to discuss bloodlines, to evaluate which dogs seemed superior to others. These gatherings were partly practical. Breeders wanted to make sure they were making good breeding choices, but they were also partly social. They were opportunities for nobles to show off their excellent dogs, to prove their sophistication and wealth through the quality of their animals. A truly exceptional dog could bring tremendous prestige to its owner. These informal competitions helped standardize what different breeds were supposed to look like and how they were supposed to behave. Gradually, through the Renaissance and the following centuries, informal standards developed. A hunting dog should look and behave a certain way. A companion dog should look and behave differently. These standards weren't written down formally yet, but they existed in the minds of breeders and in the practices of breeding communities. What's worth noting about the Renaissance period is that while the extremely wealthy enjoyed lapdogs and magnificent hunting hounds, ordinary people still had dogs for practical purposes. Middle-class merchants kept dogs to guard their shops. Craftspeople kept dogs for protection and companionship. Even peasants, though they had less leisure time than nobles, still maintained working relationships with their dogs. The difference between a noble's dog and a peasant's dog was profound in material ways. A noble's dog ate meat. A peasant's dog ate scraps. A noble's dog wore clothing and jewels. A peasant's dog wore nothing. A noble's dog slept on cushions. A peasant's dog slept on hay or dirt. Yet, in emotional ways, the relationship might have been just as deep. A peasant's dog was still a loyal companion. A peasant's dog still provided security and comfort. A peasant's dog still formed bonds with its human family. This class difference in dog ownership would persist and even intensify in later centuries, becoming one of the defining characteristics of early modern European society. But it's important to remember that across all social classes, the human-dog bond remained strong. Dogs were valued by everyone, even if that value was expressed in radically different material ways. By the end of the Renaissance and into the 17th and 18th centuries, dogs had fully established themselves as integral parts of human society. They weren't novelties anymore. They weren't exotic animals being discovered for the first time. They were normal, expected, assumed. Every household that could afford a dog had one. Dogs appeared in artwork constantly. Dogs appeared in literature. Dogs appeared in the daily life of people across all social classes. During this period, certain dog types began to become standardized enough that people used consistent names for them. A spaniel meant something specific. A mastiff meant something specific. A greyhound meant something specific. These names represented not just physical characteristics, but also temperament and use. They represented hundreds or thousands of years of selective breeding and refinement. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the rise of dog fancying as a serious pursuit. Wealthy people began to collect dogs, much as they collected art or rare plants. They wanted to own the finest examples of each breed. They wanted their bloodlines to be known as superior. They wanted to be recognized as experts in dogs. By the time we reached the 18th century, the transformation that began when that first scrawny wolf sat by an Ice Age fire was essentially complete. Dogs had gone from wild predators to domestic animals, to beloved companions, to artistic subjects, to symbols of status and virtue. They had proven their utility, their loyalty, and their capacity to bring joy into human life. Dogs had learned to live in cities and in countryside, in castles and in hovels, in palaces and in peasants' homes. They had learned to work in fields and to sit in parlors. They had learned to wear jewels and to go without clothing. They had learned to eat the finest foods and to survive on scraps. They had learned to be fierce hunters and gentle companions. They had learned to be symbols of loyalty and courage and virtue. And through it all, they had maintained the essential qualities that made them dogs. They were still loyal. They were still affectionate. They were still willing to serve humans in whatever capacity humans required. They were still capable of genuine bonds with individual people. They were still honest and uncomplicated in ways that humans often weren't. The Renaissance and subsequent centuries had cemented dogs' position not just in human society, but in human imagination. Dogs had become more than animals. They had become symbols. They represented loyalty, virtue, courage, and love. When an artist wanted to communicate a character's nobility or virtue, they added a dog to the painting. When a writer wanted to show a character's capacity for loyalty, they gave that character a dog to care for. Dogs had become woven so deeply into human culture that it was impossible to imagine society without them. They had gone from being wild animals that hung around human camps to being treated as family members. They had gone from being survival tools to being artistic subjects. They had gone from being common to being cherished. The world had changed enormously since those first Ice Age days. Humans had built civilizations. They had developed art, science, literature, music, philosophy, and all the things that make human culture remarkable. Dogs had been there for all of it, adapting, evolving, learning, growing, and humans, in return, had learned to love them, to value them, to treat them as partners and companions and friends. As we move toward the modern era, toward the present day, it's important to recognize that the foundation was laid during these centuries. The idea that dogs deserve good treatment, that dogs deserve love and care, that dogs deserve to be valued members of society, this idea solidified during the Renaissance and the following centuries. The practices that would characterize the modern human-dog relationship were being established. Dogs had proven themselves worthy of human affection, and humans had proven that they were capable of giving that affection freely, across all barriers of class and culture and time. The Renaissance celebrated human achievement, human creativity, human potential, but it also celebrated, quietly and perhaps without fully realizing it, the remarkable partnership between humans and dogs that had been developing for thousands of years. As the 17th and 18th centuries progressed, bringing with them the Age of Enlightenment and a new emphasis on scientific understanding, humans began to think about dogs in new ways. Scientists and philosophers started to study dogs more systematically. They began to ask questions about how dogs thought, how they learned, what their capacities were. Some of these early scientific investigations were crude by modern standards, but they represented a genuine attempt to understand dogs beyond simple observation and practical experience. Scientists noted that dogs had different abilities than humans, but comparable intelligence in certain areas. They noticed that dogs could be trained to do complex tasks. They recognized that dogs had emotional lives that were real and meaningful. This scientific attention lent credibility to what common people already knew intuitively. Dogs were remarkable creatures worthy of respect and study. The bond between humans and dogs wasn't just emotional or sentimental. It was based on real, observable facts about dog behavior and capability. During this period, philosophers also began to write about dogs. They considered questions about whether dogs had souls, whether dogs could feel genuine affection, whether the bond between a human and a dog was fundamentally different from bonds between humans. Some philosophers argued that dogs demonstrated virtue through their loyalty and courage. Others suggested that dogs might even teach humans important moral lessons. The Industrial Revolution would transform human society in profound ways, and dogs would have to adapt to these transformations just as they had adapted to every other change in human civilization. As people moved from rural areas to cities to work in factories, dogs moved with them. Urban dogs looked different from rural dogs. They had to be smaller to fit in city apartments. They had to be less prone to aggression, since close quarters meant conflicts were more dangerous. City life required different types of dogs than country life. In cities, you didn't need a dog that could herd sheep all day. You needed a dog that could fit in a small space, that could be walked on a leash through crowded streets, that could coexist peacefully with neighbors in close proximity. Dogs adapted to this new environment with remarkable flexibility. Yet even as dogs adapted to urban life, people missed the rural dogs they had known. This nostalgia led to the development of dogs specifically bred to look or act like rural dogs, even though they were living in cities. A person living in a crowded London neighborhood might own a small version of a hunting dog, a dog that retained some characteristics of its hunting ancestors but could function in an urban environment. The Industrial Revolution also created new wealth, and with new wealth came more leisure time for some people. The upper middle class began to emerge as a significant social group, and they had money to spend on luxuries. Dogs became one of those luxuries for this new class. A factory owner who had become wealthy could now keep expensive hunting dogs or lap dogs. A merchant's wife could have a fashionable companion dog. This period also saw the rise of dog breeding as a formal hobby and business. Kennel clubs began to form, first in Britain and then spreading to other countries. These clubs established breed standards, formal descriptions of what each breed should look like and how it should behave. They organized dog shows where breeders could compete and display their finest animals. The Victorian era, spanning most of the 19th century, was perhaps the peak of dog appreciation in human history. Victorians were obsessed with dogs. They wrote about dogs constantly. They created art featuring dogs. They bred dogs with incredible passion and dedication. They developed dog shows that became major social events. They wrote breed standards with meticulous detail. The Victorians created many of the dog breeds we know today. They formalized breed standards that had been developing informally for centuries. They created breed clubs that maintained registries and kept careful records of bloodlines. They developed a sophisticated vocabulary for discussing dogs, for describing their physical characteristics and their temperament and their uses. More importantly, Victorians created a culture where dogs were unambiguously valued members of families and society. A well-bred dog was a sign of good taste and social standing. A beloved dog was worth mourning when it died. Dogs appeared constantly in Victorian literature, art, and photography. Dogs were subjects worthy of serious attention and serious appreciation. The Victorians also developed the modern pet industry. Specialized dog foods began to be manufactured. Dog accessories became common. Veterinary medicine became more professionalized. Dogs could be bred, shown, trained, and cared for in increasingly sophisticated ways. What's particularly significant about the Victorian era is the emotional revolution that accompanied dog appreciation. It became acceptable, even fashionable, to talk openly about loving your dog. Queen Victoria herself was famous for her love of her dogs. She had multiple beloved animals and mourned them deeply when they died. This royal approval of dog love gave permission to ordinary people to express their affection for their dogs openly. In earlier eras, Expressing deep attachment to an animal might have been seen as foolish or frivolous. By the Victorian era, it was seen as normal and even admirable. People began to write poetry about their dogs. They created elaborate memorials to deceased dogs. They dressed dogs in clothing. They had photographs taken with their dogs. They discussed their dogs' personalities, quirks, and achievements with the same engagement they might have discussed other family members. This emotional intensity had real consequences. People were willing to pay veterinarians to treat sick or injured dogs. They were willing to spend money on special foods and accessories. They were willing to invest time and energy into training and socializing their dogs properly. Dogs were no longer just tools or even just companions. They were loved family members. While wealthy people had always been able to keep dogs for pleasure, the 19th century saw dog keeping become increasingly democratized. Middle-class people could now afford to keep dogs that served primarily as companions. Working-class people could have dogs in their homes, even if those dogs didn't contribute to household income. Dogs became accessible across the social spectrum in ways they never had been before. A factory worker could save money to buy a puppy from a breeder. A school teacher could keep a dog for companionship while living in town. A shopkeeper could have a dog that lived in the shop and provided both security and companionship. This democratization meant that the benefits of human-dog companionship were no longer restricted to the wealthy. Ordinary people could experience the joy of having a beloved dog. They could feel the comfort of a dog's loyalty and affection. They could participate in the growing culture of dog appreciation. The 19th century saw an explosion of dog literature. Stories, novels, and poetry featuring dogs became incredibly popular. Some of these stories were sentimental and emotional. Others were more practical, focusing on a dog's exploits or adventures. But all of them testified to the deep cultural importance of dogs in the 19th century imagination. Dogs began to appear frequently in children's literature. Parents wanted their children to develop proper attitudes toward animals, and dogs became the primary vehicle for teaching children about loyalty, courage, and kindness. A child who read stories about dogs was being trained to appreciate and value these creatures. The Victorians also created a rich mythology around dogs. They celebrated certain dogs as heroes. They mourned famous dogs that died. They told and retold stories about loyal dogs that had saved people's lives. These stories became part of the cultural fabric, transmitted through families and communities. By the end of the 19th century, dog breeds had become highly standardized. The major breeds that we recognize today had been formalized. Breed clubs existed to maintain standards and keep registries. Selective breeding had become sophisticated and scientifically informed, or at least informed by careful observation and record-keeping. Different breeds had different purposes, different looks, different temperaments. A bulldog looked completely different from a greyhound. A poodle had a completely different appearance than a setter. Yet all of these dogs were the result of centuries of selective breeding, starting from the same basic wolf ancestor. This standardization meant that when you encountered a particular breed, you knew roughly what to expect. You knew what the dog would look like. You had some idea of its temperament and energy level. You understood what it had been bred to do, even if it was now living a completely different life. As we look back on the centuries from the Renaissance through the Industrial Revolution and into the Victorian era, we see a consistent pattern. Humans and dogs grew closer. The bond deepened. The appreciation increased. Dogs became more than just useful animals. They became beloved companions, cultural icons, and symbols of human values. Through all of this, dogs remained essentially what they had always been. They were loyal. They were capable of genuine affection. They were adaptable to new circumstances. They were honest in their emotions and their intentions. They didn't pretend or deceive. They didn't hold grudges or seek revenge. They simply loved their humans and wanted to be part of human life. And humans, for their part, gradually learned to give dogs the respect and appreciation they had earned over thousands of years. What began as a practical relationship based on survival needs became an emotional relationship based on genuine affection. What began as an exchange of services became a partnership based on mutual love and loyalty. The journey was not always smooth. Dogs experienced hardship and abuse. Not all humans treated dogs well. Selective breeding created health problems that dogs had to live with. Yet despite these difficulties, the overall trajectory was upward. Humans and dogs moved closer together. The bond deepened. The appreciation grew. By the time we reached the 19th century, the modern human-dog relationship was essentially in place. Dogs were valued members of families. They were loved and cherished. They were given care and attention. They were mourned when they died. They were celebrated in art, literature, and culture. The foundation that had been laid over thousands of years had solidified into the relationship we know today. We're nearing the end of our journey through time, dear friend, and it feels fitting that we arrive here, in the modern world, with all the comforts surrounding you as you listen to this story. The 20th century and beyond would see dogs become more integrated into human life than ever before. Not because the bond suddenly grew stronger, that bond had been building for thousands of years, but because modern technology and modern society created new ways for humans and dogs to share their lives. The 20th century brought with it rapid social change. Automobiles replaced horses. Cities grew larger and more crowded. Families became smaller. Work took people away from home for longer hours. Life became faster, more complicated, more stressful. And in the midst of all this change and chaos, dogs became more important, not less. For people struggling with the rapid pace of modern life, dogs offered stability and connection. A dog didn't care about your job or your social status. A dog didn't judge you for your failures or your mistakes. A dog simply wanted your presence and your affection. In a world that was becoming increasingly complicated and alienating, dogs offered simplicity and genuine connection. The 20th century also saw the rise of psychology and an increased awareness of mental health. Scientists began to study the effects of human-animal interaction. They discovered what people had known intuitively for thousands of years. Dogs were good for you. They lowered stress. They increased happiness. They provided comfort in times of difficulty. This scientific validation gave people permission to keep dogs, not just because they wanted to, but because it was actually good for their health. The 20th century saw veterinary medicine professionalize and expand dramatically. What had once been a relatively informal practice became a sophisticated medical field. Veterinarians received formal training. They had access to modern medical equipment and pharmaceuticals. They could diagnose diseases and perform surgeries. Dogs could receive medical care that would have been impossible a century before. This professionalization of veterinary medicine meant that dogs could live longer, healthier lives. Problems that would have meant death for a dog in earlier centuries could now be treated and cured. A dog that broke a bone could have it set and healed properly. A dog with an infection could receive antibiotics. A dog with a tumor could have it surgically removed. The development of veterinary medicine also meant that people were more willing to invest in their dog's health. If you knew that your dog could be cured of an illness or injury, you were more likely to seek treatment. And if you sought treatment, you were investing emotional energy in your dog's well-being, which further deepened the bond. By the middle of the 20th century, dogs had become standard members of the modern family in many Western countries. Families with children often had dogs. The idea was that a dog could teach a child about responsibility, loyalty, and love. A child who grew up with a dog would develop character qualities that would serve them well in life. Dogs in the modern family served many roles simultaneously. They were companions for lonely children. They were playmates for active children. They were comfort for children dealing with difficult emotions. They were teachers of responsibility for teenagers learning to care for another living creature. They were companions for aging grandparents living with their families. The modern family dog often had more freedom than dogs in any previous era. Instead of being confined to a yard or a kennel, family dogs lived inside the home. They slept in bedrooms. They sat on couches. They ate at the family dinner table, or at least begged at the family dinner table with puppy dog eyes that had been refined over thousands of years of evolution to be irresistible. This integration into family life meant that dogs experienced more consistent human affection than ever before. A working dog in an earlier era might have been cared for adequately, but kept at a distance. A family dog in the 20th century was treated like a family member, given constant attention and affection. The 20th century saw dog shows become more popular and more sophisticated than ever before. What had begun as informal gatherings of breeders had evolved into massive competitions with thousands of dogs and tens of thousands of spectators. Dog shows became cultural events, televised and celebrated. These shows continued to serve the function of maintaining breed standards, but they also served other purposes. They were entertainment. They were community. They were celebrations of human appreciation for dogs. People who weren't breeders or competitors could attend shows simply to admire beautiful dogs and learn about different breeds. Dogs that won prestigious shows became celebrities. They appeared in magazines and on television. They received fan mail. They were used in advertising. Some showed dogs became more famous than many human celebrities. This popularity indicated something important about modern culture. Dogs had achieved a status of genuine cultural significance. The 20th century saw the development of dogs specially trained to help humans in specific ways. Guide dogs for the blind became more systematized and more effective. Service dogs for people with disabilities were trained to perform specific tasks. Therapy dogs began to be used in hospitals and nursing homes. Police dogs and military dogs served important functions in law enforcement and defense. These working dogs represented a new kind of relationship between humans and dogs. The dogs were trained to perform specific functions, yes, but they were also treated with respect and affection. They were cared for properly. Their welfare was considered important. Their work was valued and appreciated. Guide dogs were particularly significant because they demonstrated that dogs could improve human lives in concrete, measurable ways. A blind person with a guide dog could navigate the world independently in ways that would have been impossible without that dog. The dog's intelligence, training, and loyalty created possibilities that had not existed before. As the 20th century progressed, scientists began to study dogs more intensively. They studied dog cognition, trying to understand how dogs thought and learned. They studied dog behavior, trying to understand why dogs did the things they did. They studied the human-dog bond itself, trying to understand the neurochemistry of attachment and affection. These scientific studies validated what people had known for thousands of years. Dogs were intelligent, capable of complex emotions, and fully worthy of human love and affection. Dogs weren't simple creatures operating on instinct alone. They could think, problem solve, learn, and genuinely care about their humans. Scientists also discovered that the human-dog bond was deeply rooted in biology. When a human and dog looked at each other, oxytocin, the bonding hormone, was released in both of them. This explained why the connection felt so real and so strong. It wasn't just sentimental attachment, it was biochemistry. It was real at a fundamental level. Throughout the 20th century, individual stories of human-dog bonds continued to be told and retold. Stories of dogs that had saved people's lives. Stories of dogs that had provided comfort during difficult times. Stories of lifelong friendships between humans and their dogs. These personal stories were important because they documented something that statistics and scientific studies couldn't fully capture: the emotional reality of the human-dog bond. Every family had a dog story. Every person who had grown up with a dog had memories of that dog. These memories were treasured, passed down through families, sometimes preserved in photographs and written accounts. When a beloved dog died, people mourned as they would mourn a human family member. This grief was real and valid. The stories preserve the wisdom that humans had learned over thousands of years of living alongside dogs. They taught new generations about loyalty, about unconditional love, about the rewards of caring for another living creature. They kept alive the understanding that dogs were not just animals, but partners and friends and family members. By the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, the human-dog relationship had reached a state that would have seemed like fantasy to our Ice Age ancestors. Dogs were beloved. They were celebrated. They were treated as family members. They were cared for with veterinary medicine that would have seemed miraculous. They had rights and protections. They had laws enacted in their favor. Yet at the same time, this modern relationship was built on thousands of years of history. Every characteristic that modern humans admired in dogs, their loyalty, their affection, their intelligence, their adaptability, had been selected for and refined over countless generations. The lapdog trembling on a velvet cushion was the descendant of that first scrawny wolf who decided human camps were better than fighting other wolves. The hunting dog sprinting through forests was descended from the first dogs who helped Ice Age hunters. The guide dog helping a blind person navigate the city was descended from dogs who guided human hunters through forests and across plains. The therapy dog comforting a patient in a hospital was descended from dogs who comforted frightened humans around primitive fires thousands of years ago. Every moment in modern times, when a human hugs their dog, or feeds their dog a meal, or plays with their dog, or sleeps with their dog, is a continuation of a relationship that began in the Ice Age. Every bond that forms between a human and a dog is a recreation of that first bond, that first agreement between species. What we've learned through this journey through history is that the human-dog relationship is one of the most fundamental and enduring relationships in human experience. It transcends culture, transcends geography, transcends time itself. Dogs have been there through every era of human civilization. They've adapted to every change. They've found their place in every society. And what they've brought to human life is immeasurable. They've brought security and protection. They've brought companionship and love. They've brought joy and laughter. They've brought comfort in times of difficulty. They've brought meaning and purpose. They've taught us about loyalty and about uncomplicated affection. They've shown us how to love without judgment, how to forgive without holding grudges, how to be present without needing to understand everything. In return, humans have brought dogs from wild predators to beloved family members. We've created safe homes for them. We've developed medicine to heal their injuries and illnesses. We've selected for traits that make them better companions. We've written stories about them, created art featuring them, built culture around them. We've given them names and personas and places in our hearts. As you lie there, comfortable and warm, perhaps with a dog of your own nearby, take a moment to appreciate the remarkable history that has brought you to this moment. That comfort you feel, that sense of safety, that companionship, has roots going back thousands of years. It's built on countless human-dog interactions, countless acts of loyalty and kindness, countless moments of genuine connection between species. Every dog that's alive today carries within it the genetic legacy of all the dogs that came before. Every dog carries the adaptations that have been selected for across thousands of generations. Every dog carries the capacity for loyalty and affection that made their species valuable to humans in the first place. And every human who loves a dog is participating in a tradition that goes back to the beginning of human civilization. You're not doing anything new or unique. You're doing something that humans have been doing for thousands of years. You're continuing a partnership that has endured through ice ages and empires, through wars and plagues, through revolutions and social upheavals. So here we are, at the end of our journey through time. We've watched dogs evolve from wild wolves to beloved companions. We've seen them serve as hunters, as guards, as symbols of status, as artists' muses, as scientists' subjects, as therapists' tools, as family members. We've seen them in palaces and in peasant huts, in castles and in modern apartments, in deserts and in snow-covered lands. Through it all, one truth has remained constant. Dogs chose us, and we chose them. It wasn't a choice made once and then forgotten. It was a choice made again and again, thousands and thousands of times, across thousands of years, by countless humans and countless dogs. Dogs could have remained wild. They chose to live with us. Humans could have rejected them. We chose to welcome them. Together, we created something beautiful and enduring. We created a partnership that has enriched both species immeasurably. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps with a dog curled up nearby, remember this: you are part of an ancient tradition. You are continuing a story that began in Ice Age darkness and has echoed through every era of human history. You are participating in one of humanity's greatest achievements, not building pyramids or inventing electricity or exploring space, but creating a genuine partnership with another species based on love and loyalty. Dogs have been humanity's best friends, not because we trained them to be, not because we forced them into the role, but because they chose to be. And we, recognizing their value and their loyalty, chose to cherish them in return. That choice has been made again and again across thousands of years, until it became the most natural thing in the world. So tonight, as you settle into sleep, let yourself feel grateful for dogs, grateful for what they bring to our lives, grateful for their presence through all of history, grateful for their loyalty and their love, grateful for the simple fact that they're here with us, that they've chosen to be with us, that they continue to be our companions through all the changes and challenges of life. The journey of dogs and humans through history is a love story. It's not the dramatic kind of love story you find in novels, though it certainly has moments of drama. It's a quieter kind of love story, the kind built over time through daily acts of kindness and loyalty. It's the kind of story that doesn't get written down often, but is lived and relived in millions of homes every single day. And that love story continues. Every dog alive today is part of it. Every human who loves a dog is part of it. You're part of it. Your dog, if you have one, is part of it. And as long as humans and dogs exist, this story will continue, evolving and changing but remaining fundamentally the same, a story of two species who found each other in the darkness and decided that together life was better. Thank you for spending this time with me on this journey through history. Thank you for listening to the story of how dogs became our closest companions. As you drift off to sleep now, I hope you feel the weight of this history, the significance of this bond. I hope you feel connected to all the humans who came before you, all the dogs who helped shape our world. Sleep well, friend, and when you wake, maybe take a moment to appreciate the dog in your life, or think about the dogs you've known, because they are part of a story that spans millennia. They are part of something bigger than themselves and bigger than you. They are part of the greatest partnership in human history, the partnership of humans and dogs, walking side by side through time, from Ice Age fires to the modern world, from the beginning of history to whatever comes next. The story of humans and dogs is the story of loyalty, of unconditional love, of finding family where you didn't expect to find it. And as long as there are humans and dogs in this world, that story will continue. It will be retold in new homes, with new dogs and new people. But the fundamental truth will remain the same. We need them, they need us, and together we are better than we are apart. Now close your eyes. Breathe deeply, feel the warmth and safety around you, and know that you're part of a tradition that stretches back through thousands of years of human history. You're part of something beautiful and enduring. You're part of the human dog story, one of the greatest stories ever told.